And I think what it focuses on is the idea of trust. Trust is a precious commodity, isn't it? Now, when we were children, trust was pretty easy to give. This symbolizes trust to me when I was a kid. This is the monkey I slept with. When I was a kid, as I told Gracie, I was younger than her when I got this. It got chewed on a little bit and everything. But I trusted this guy to watch over me at night when I slept. You know, there were no monsters or anything scary was going to get me because he was going to protect me. Okay, believe me, as a kid, he looked a lot tougher. All right? But the idea was, as a kid, we trust. Trust is easy. Trust is simple. As we get older, though, trust is a little tougher to share. Trust is a little tougher to give. We look for any reason to yank back that trust, too, don't we? Well, I trust you. But we don't really. I mean, when you say we trust somebody, it usually is also followed by silently, but if you mess up, I'm never trusting you again. And maybe that's cynical to think, but isn't that how a lot of us feel? We have a scripture this morning that talks about trust. Naaman is a great military leader, highly respected, and at least had some favor with God because it says, through the Lord he was given victory in battle. But Naaman had a problem. He had leprosy. Now we know scripturally kind of what it means. Historically, leprosy referred to multiple different skin conditions. It was a skin issue. But we know that there was a lot of different issues like that. And it talks about in Scripture what are the requirements for somebody who had leprosy, a skin disease. And it talks about how they would have to tear their clothes, stay away from people, scream unclean if anybody came near them. These were the rules if you had leprosy. Everybody knew you had leprosy. Now, I'm just speculating here, but considering probably the status that Naaman had, he probably tried to hide it for a while. You wouldn't want to let this get out, because especially during that time, they considered if you had leprosy or a skin disease or something like that, you had done something wrong, and therefore it was your fault. And the gods or God was basically punishing you for whatever it was. So you wouldn't bring attention to it in any way. But eventually, the servants became aware of what was happening to Naaman, that he had leprosy. Because the servant of Naaman's wife said that the prophet, who was Elijah, could cure him. And after, of course, some conversations with his king and Israel king, he ends up getting to Elijah's house. Now, did anybody pick up on the fact that Elijah never actually spoke to Naaman? He sent a messenger to speak to him. Naaman is this great military leader, highly respected, sent by two kings, and Elijah sends a messenger to talk to him. He doesn't even talk to him himself. Can you imagine what this would have felt like to Naaman? This would have almost been a slap in the face, a lack of respect. And then this servant, this messenger, says Naaman's got to go jump in the dirty water and wash himself 7 times. I think it's interesting, Naaman's response. Because he responds as a man who understands orders, both giving and receiving. He says, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. He wanted Elijah to order the leprosy away. That's basically what he was saying. He wanted to command this leprosy away. And this is a reflection on Naaman, because he knew what it meant to give commands, to give orders, to give direction, and for it to be followed. This is how Naaman responded to problems, to issues. He ordered them to be taken care of, and they were. But then he kind of continues on and does something that's kind of odd for a man who's in the military. He questions the order. After wondering why, Elijah didn't just order the leprosy away. He says, "Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" Now, according to the stories, the Jordan River was not very clean. So we can kind of understand what he's talking about. And then he runs off in a rage. He's ticked. He's upset. He went to Elijah seeking help, seeking healing. And he didn't like what he heard. He didn't trust what he heard. I'm going to come back to that. But have any of you ever heard of Charles, and I hope I'm pronouncing his last name, Blondin? Anybody ever heard of him? He was a famous French tightrope walker. His greatest fame came on September 14th, 1816. So it's pretty recently, so I'm surprised you all don't remember. But he was the first person to cross a tightrope stretched 11,000 feet over a quarter of a mile across Niagara Falls. People from both sides, both Canada and America, I mean, they rushed to see this. They came from miles to see this guy, this famous guy, cross over Niagara Falls on a tightrope. He walked across 160 feet above the falls several times, each time getting more and more elaborate with his displays. Once, in a sack, on stilts, on a bicycle, in the dark, and blindfolded. Yeah, it's like, how does that work? I have not found a picture of this, but I really want to find a picture to see how this is illustrated, because that's impressive. Just going across is impressive. One time, he carried a stove and cooked an omelet in the middle of the rope. I can't cook an omelet when I'm not on a tightrope. So, of course, the crowds gathered. Obviously, there are more and more people that are gathering all the time, I'm sure. Along both sides, and of course, everybody's, ooh, you know how it is. One time, though, he pushed a wheelbarrow across with a sack of potatoes in it. Now, maybe it doesn't sound as impressive as some of the other ones may be, but then he turned to the crowd and says, "Anybody trust that I can push this wheelbarrow across with somebody in it?" And of course, everybody's like, "Oh yeah, you're wonderful, you're great, you're phenomenal, of course you can do it." And then he says, "Who will volunteer?" Probably could hear a pin drop. Right? Because how many of you would be willing to volunteer? Okay, I'm pretty good with heights, but that's just nuts. Nobody volunteered. You see, it's easy to say you trust somebody, but it's completely different to show it. Now, in case you're going to be worked up through the whole sermon until I tell you how it ends, the story goes that either his manager or his mother climbed in the wheelbarrow and went across. They don't have a lot of documentation on it, though. So. But you see, the people watching Blondin and Naaman both responded with trust, but they didn't show it. The crowd watching Blondin said, "Yeah, we believe." But then, maybe not so much. Naaman went out of his way and shared, and remember, he shared with his king with another king, with other people, the fact that he had leprosy. This could very well have destroyed his life if this had gotten out and he was not healed. He did all of this, and then he was told to go wash, and he said, no, I don't trust you. He didn't believe. I think an issue that Naaman had was Elijah, in essence, put him in his place. Naaman only spoke to the messenger and not to Elijah himself. And Elijah then handled the healing in a way that Naaman didn't like. Naaman, I think, maybe just had an ego. And it needed deflated. Maybe leprosy was God's way of getting Naaman's attention. Because if you read further on, it actually was pretty an interesting story. So I would encourage you to read on and find out more about Naaman. And again, thinking about his deflated ego now, when did Naaman actually go and wash? After he listened to his servants. I'm sure he normally would not have. But at this point, he probably thought, what do I have to lose? Of course, he was healed. He had to trust God. He had to trust the words that Elijah was sharing from God. He had to trust in something that he could not see, or, again, a big one for him, or something he could not order around. He had to give trust in something other than himself. And we have to do that too, don't we? We have to trust in a God without skin on. You ever heard that phrase? A God without skin on. Now understand, I'm not saying that Jesus was not God and he didn't come to earth, but we don't see that nowadays, do we? We have to trust in a God with no skin on. We have to trust in the Spirit of God without being able to physically touch. A God we have never actually seen in person. That seems to be the biggest trust issue for us all. For us to be willing to trust something or someone we cannot quantify, measure, examine, maybe even take apart. With God, we can't do that. God is God. By his very definition, he is immeasurable. He is unable to be put in a box. Just when we think we've got it figured out, something changes. We must trust in a God who constantly is leading us in a new direction. He takes us step by step through new ways and new ideas of learning to be his people. Think about it this way. How many of you took math in school? I know, dumb question, right? Well, yeah. Now, when you started out in math in school, you started out with addition and subtraction, right? Really simple. And you know that when you were doing your adding and addition, that you were told if you got a number less than 0, your answer was wrong, right? You can't. When you were starting out, you could not get an answer that was less than 0. And you also knew that if you added 0 or subtracted 0, it didn't change the answer at all, did it? And then you trusted that math. Then as you got older, you got into algebra and geometry. This is where I started struggling myself, just in case y'all wanted to know. And you find out 0 does change things. Multiplication and decimal points and all these different things. And 0 does change things. You can have a number less than 0. You can have negative numbers. Right? Does this mean that your earlier learning was wrong? That you couldn't trust it? No, not at all. It just means you've gone a step further. You're learning more. You're continuing to grow in your learning. You had to take it step by step, though, too, didn't you? Can you imagine being in first grade and being given geometry and algebra and addition and subtraction and multiplication and division? You'd go nuts. There's no way you could do that. You have to do it step by step by step. And it doesn't mean you can't trust the prior steps. You can trust that you're building on those prior steps. God is the same way. In Deuteronomy 23, we learn that Moabites are bad and evil. And yet, we also read the book of Ruth, who was a Moabite. Got her own book in the Bible. She's probably a nice lady then, don't you think? In Jeremiah 25, we learn that the people of Uz are evil and bad. But then we read about Job, who also had his own book in the Bible, and who is, quote, the most blameless man on earth. In Deuteronomy 23, we read foreigners and eunuchs are not allowed among the people. And yet we read in Acts 8 that an African eunuch is welcomed into the church. In the Bible, we see that Samaritans were enemies of the Israelite people. And didn't you just read about Elijah being in Samaria? And didn't we hear that, what's that one story? The Good Samaritan that Jesus himself talked about? And so the question may be, does that mean that we can't trust God? Well, no, of course not. God is trustworthy. He always is. This just means, though, that God is taking us step by step through our walk to becoming the people He wants us to be. We must trust Him to take us where He wants us to be. We trust Him to know what's best for us. We trust Him in everything, or we should. It's scary, I know, to trust when we don't know the final outcome. I mean, we know the final outcome, but we don't necessarily know the steps, do we? Isn't it scary? You know where you're going to end up. Those steps in between can be scary. I trust God. We don't know how the story will go, but we do know how the story ends. And believe me, I understand trust being an issue myself. In fact, I struggled with it so much. I actually, one of my favorite verses in Scripture is Isaiah 40:31, and it says, "For those who trust upon the Lord, you will rise up on wings like eagles. You will run and not grow weary. You will not walk and not be faint." I actually got that tattooed on my arm because I need that constant reminder. Now, believe me, I'm not saying everybody needs to run out and get a tattoo too. Although that would be cool if y'all got one together, wouldn't it? I mean, if that doesn't show solidarity, I don't know what does. But I will tell you, we all constantly need reminders, don't we? We all need reminders about trust. God can be trusted. Always can be trusted. There's never a time that you can say, well, I'm not sure I can trust God. You can. If you need a sign to know whether or not you can trust God, this is it. You can trust God. Now, sometimes it doesn't always seem like God makes sense. And I think we can all agree with that. There are times you have no idea what God is doing. But He always can be trusted. I think Stephen Curtis Chapman, a Christian musician, I think he's actually said it really, really well in trusting God and diving in when we kind of struggle. He had a song a number of years ago called Dive. And I want to read some of the lyrics. Don't worry, I'm not singing. Nobody wants that. But the words are, my heart is racing and my feet are weak. Anybody else feel like that? As I walk to the edge, I know there's no turning back. Once my feet have left the ledge, and in the rush, I hear a voice that's telling me to take a leap of faith. So here I go. I'm diving in, I'm going deep, and over my head I want to be. Caught in the rush, lost in the flow, and over my head I want to go. The river's deep, the river's wide, the river's water is alive. So sink or swim, I'm diving in. There is a supernatural power in this mighty river's flow. It can bring the dead to life, and it can fill an empty soul. I liken it to, you guys remember when you were kids and mom or dad was in the pool or in the pond or lake or whatever, and they'd say jump? Did you ever hesitate when you were little? Now, as you got older, dad might be like, oh, I'm going to let you say it. But when you were little, didn't you just trust? You just jumped. Your feet left the ledge. You trusted that somebody was going to be there to catch you. That somebody was going to make sure you didn't sink. God is that person. And the amazing thing is, he can always be trusted. And isn't it weird to say it's amazing that we can trust God? But when we look at it from a human perspective, it's hard to understand that you can trust somebody that completely. But we can. Because God is God. I want to challenge each one of you to be willing to dive in. Again, we're going to be starting this new impact program. And it's going to mean we're going to change things a little bit, maybe. We're not necessarily doing away with anything, but maybe approaching it from a different view. We have to be willing to dive in. Trusting that God's going to lead us in the right way. No matter how scary it is, we need to trust Him, always. Today, you're going to be joining together in communion, and we'll be doing things